Picture this. It's August 5th, 1392, and the King of France is riding through a forest with his royal guards, heading to punish a traitor who tried to assassinate his closest advisor. The king is 24 years old, beloved by his people, and known throughout Europe as one of the most promising rulers of his generation. His knights are laughing, the summer sun is shining, and everything seems perfect. Then suddenly, a half-naked man jumps out from behind the trees and grabs the king's horse, screaming warnings about betrayal and death. The man disappears as quickly as he appeared, but something in the king's eyes has changed. His face goes pale, his hands start shaking, and then, without any warning, King Charles VI of France draws his sword and begins slaughtering his own knights. Can you imagine the horror? One moment, these loyal men are protecting their king. The next moment, their beloved ruler is hacking them to pieces, screaming that they're traitors trying to kill him. The attack lasts for what feels like an eternity, until finally, exhausted, the king collapses unconscious in the forest, covered in the blood of men who had sworn to die for him. This wasn't some political assassination or palace coup. This was the beginning of a mental breakdown that would destroy not just a king, but an entire kingdom. Charles VI, known as Charles the Beloved, had just experienced the first major episode of a condition that would plague him for the next 30 years and change the course of European history forever. If royal mental health breakdowns and how personal tragedy can reshape entire nations fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, please subscribe to the channel, because today you're going to discover how one king's shattered mind led to the conquest of France, decades of civil war, and the rise of English power that would dominate Europe for generations. Because here's what makes Charles VI's story so tragically compelling. He wasn't some cruel tyrant or weak ruler. Historical records show he was intelligent, charismatic, and genuinely loved by his people. France was finally recovering from decades of war and plague. The kingdom was getting stronger. Everything was going right. But the human mind, even a royal one, can be more fragile than any crown or castle, and when it breaks, the consequences can echo through centuries. After that forest massacre, Charles VI would spend years believing he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him. He would forget he was king, refuse to recognize his own wife and children, and leave his kingdom defenseless while his nobles tore France apart in a brutal civil war. The English, seeing opportunity in chaos, would invade and nearly succeed in conquering the entire country. One moment of madness in a forest would lead directly to English boots marching through Paris and a French king being forced to disinherit his own son. But how did the most beloved king in French history become a man so broken that his own mind became his kingdom's greatest enemy? The answer begins with understanding just how golden his early years actually were. To understand how devastating Charles's mental breakdown truly was, you need to know just how perfect everything seemed before it all went wrong. This wasn't the story of some obviously unstable ruler finally cracking under pressure. This was the complete destruction of what appeared to be a fairy tale kingship. Charles VI became King of France in 1380 when he was just 11 years old, after his father, Charles V, died unexpectedly. Now, normally, having a child king would spell disaster for any medieval kingdom. But Charles VI got incredibly lucky with his regents. His 4 uncles who ruled France while he grew up actually knew what they were doing. The Dukes of Berry, Burgundy, Anjou, and Bourbon managed to keep the kingdom stable, the economy growing, and the English mostly at bay during those crucial early years. More importantly, they made sure young Charles received an excellent education. Court records show he was intelligent, curious, and genuinely interested in learning how to be a good king. When Charles finally took personal control of the government in 1388 at age 20, something remarkable happened. The people absolutely loved him. And we're not talking about the fake kind of popularity that royal propaganda usually created. Contemporary chronicles from across France describe genuine enthusiasm for their young king. They called him Charles the Beloved, and it wasn't just a fancy title. He was tall, handsome, athletic, and charismatic. He spoke multiple languages fluently, loved music and art, and actually seemed to care about his subjects' well-being. French nobles who had grown cynical about royal authority found themselves genuinely impressed by this young man's intelligence and dedication. Even better, Charles proved he could fight. His early military campaigns against rebellious nobles were swift and successful. When the city of Paris rioted in 1382, Charles handled the situation with exactly the right mixture of firmness and mercy that earned him even more respect. He was developing into exactly the kind of strong, wise king that France desperately needed. And France really did need a strong king in 1388. The kingdom was slowly recovering from the catastrophic decades of the Black Death, which had killed roughly a third of the population. The 100 Years' War with England was still technically ongoing, but it had settled into an uneasy truce that gave France breathing room to rebuild. The economy was stabilizing, trade was recovering, and there was genuine optimism in the air. For the first time in generations, it looked like France might actually have a golden age ahead of it. Charles VI seemed destined to be remembered alongside the greatest kings in French history. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about how impressed they were with the young French monarch. Marriage proposals arrived from royal families across Europe, all wanting to ally themselves with this rising star. Everything was going so perfectly that it almost seemed too good to be true. And as it turned out, it was too good to be true. Because by 1392, just 4 years into his personal rule, careful observers at court began noticing subtle changes in the king that would make them deeply uncomfortable. The pressure of ruling an entire kingdom was starting to show, and Charles VI was beginning to crack in ways that no one fully understood yet. The first people to notice something was wrong were probably the servants who dressed King Charles every morning. Starting around 1390, they began whispering to each other about how the king would sometimes stare off into space for long minutes, as if he was somewhere else entirely. Sometimes he'd ask the same question multiple times in a single conversation, forgetting he'd already received an answer. But these were subtle things, easy to dismiss. After all, Charles VI was running an entire kingdom while barely into his 20s. The stress of medieval kingship could break much older, more experienced men. And the stress was definitely mounting. By 1391, the comfortable truce with England was falling apart. Henry IV was making aggressive moves that suggested the 100 Years' War was about to heat up again. Charles was getting pressured from all sides to take decisive military action, but every choice seemed to lead toward massive, expensive warfare that could bankrupt the kingdom. Even worse, his own family was becoming a problem. Those same uncles who had governed so well during his childhood were now competing for influence over the adult king. The Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Orléans were developing a bitter rivalry that was splitting the court into hostile factions. Charles found himself constantly having to mediate between powerful men who were supposed to be helping him rule. The political pressure was relentless. Every decision Charles made seemed to create new enemies. When he tried to stay neutral between his quarreling uncles, both sides accused him of favoritism. When he attempted to raise taxes for military campaigns, the nobles complained. When he tried to negotiate with the English, people called him weak. When he prepared for war, they called him reckless. Court physicians noted that Charles was sleeping poorly and complaining of headaches that lasted for days. He was becoming irritable in ways that seemed completely unlike his previously calm, diplomatic personality. Sometimes he would explode into sudden rages over minor problems, then seem confused about why he had gotten so angry. But it was in the summer of 1392 that everything began accelerating toward disaster. Charles became obsessed with punishing Pierre de Craon, a nobleman who had attempted to assassinate the king's close advisor, Olivier de Clisson. What should have been a routine matter of royal justice became something much more personal and intense for Charles. The king began talking about de Craon constantly, working himself into increasingly emotional states about the betrayal. He couldn't seem to think about anything else. He started planning an elaborate military expedition to Brittany to personally hunt down this traitor, despite his advisors pointing out that this was a massive overreaction to what was essentially a failed assassination attempt. Then, in July 1392, Charles fell seriously ill with a high fever that lasted for several days. Medieval medicine being what it was, no one really understood what was happening to the king's body or brain during this illness. But when he recovered, people who knew him well noticed he seemed different somehow, more volatile, more suspicious, quicker to anger. His determination to personally lead the expedition against de Craon became an absolute obsession. Nothing anyone said could talk him out of it. And so, against the advice of nearly everyone at court, Charles VI set out for Brittany in early August, convinced he was on a righteous mission that would prove his strength as a king. He had no idea he was riding toward the complete destruction of his mind. August 5th, 1392. Started like any other day of royal travel. King Charles VI was riding through the forest of Le Mans with his entourage, including his brother Louis of Orléans, several trusted knights, and court officials. They were heading to Brittany to deal with Pierre de Craon. And despite the summer heat, everyone seemed to be in good spirits. The king was wearing light armor and riding his favorite horse. Contemporary accounts describe him as appearing completely normal that morning, talking with his companions, discussing strategy, maybe even joking around. There was absolutely nothing to suggest that within hours, this routine journey would become the most terrifying day in French royal history. But then, around noon, as they passed through a particularly dense section of forest, a figure suddenly burst out from behind the trees. Historical chronicles describe him as a half-naked man, probably a hermit or someone suffering from mental illness himself. He grabbed the bridle of the king's horse and started shouting warnings. "King, do not ride further! You are betrayed! Turn back!" The man's appearance was so sudden and shocking that several horses reared up in panic. Guards immediately moved to protect the king, roughly pushing the stranger away. Within moments, the mysterious figure had disappeared back into the forest, leaving everyone shaken but trying to act like nothing had happened. Except Charles VI couldn't shake off what had just occurred. Witnesses reported that his face went completely pale. His hands started trembling. He kept looking back over his shoulder, as if expecting more attackers to emerge from the trees. His brother tried to reassure him, pointing out that the man was obviously just a mad hermit, but Charles seemed unable to calm down. Then someone in the group accidentally dropped a lance, and the metal clanging against a rock created a sharp, sudden noise that echoed through the forest. And that's when King Charles VI completely lost his mind. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, the sound seemed to trigger something catastrophic in the king's brain. He suddenly screamed, "Away, traitors! They wish to deliver me to the enemy," and drew his sword with lightning speed. What happened next was absolute carnage. Charles began attacking everyone around him. His own brother, his loyal knights, men who had sworn to die protecting him. He was screaming about traitors and enemies while hacking at anyone within reach. The attack was so sudden and vicious that several men were seriously wounded before anyone could react. Guys, if you're loving this journey through how royal mental health crises changed history, please subscribe to the channel because what I'm about to reveal next will blow your mind and show you just how far a king's psychological breakdown could actually go. The attack continued for what felt like an eternity. Charles fought with the strength and fury of a man possessed, completely unable to recognize friend from foe. Finally, after what chronicles describe as a prolonged and terrifying battle, the king collapsed from exhaustion, falling unconscious in the forest dirt. When he woke up hours later, Charles VI had no memory of what had happened. But his mind had been fundamentally broken, and what emerged from that forest would be a completely different person than the beloved king who had entered it. The man who believed he was made of glass was about to be born. When Charles VI finally regained consciousness after his forest rampage, he seemed like himself again. He was confused about what had happened, apologetic about the violence, and appeared to recognize everyone around him. For a few weeks, court officials desperately hoped that whatever had occurred was just a one-time incident brought on by stress and summer heat. They were catastrophically wrong. Within months, the king, who had once been the pride of France, began experiencing episodes that were so bizarre, they seemed like something out of a nightmare. The most famous and disturbing of these was his unshakable belief that his body was made of glass. Historical records from court physicians describe how Charles would become absolutely convinced that he was constructed entirely of fragile glass that could shatter at the slightest touch. During these episodes, he would refuse to sit down, terrified that the pressure would crack his glass body into pieces. He wouldn't allow anyone to come near him, panicking that even a gentle touch would cause him to explode into deadly shards. The practical challenges this created were enormous. How do you dress a king who believes fabric will shatter him? How do you feed someone who thinks eating will break him from the inside? Court attendants had to develop elaborate strategies to care for Charles during his glass episodes, sometimes going days without being able to properly tend to his basic needs. But the glass delusion was just the beginning. During other episodes, Charles would completely forget that he was the King of France. He would wander the palace corridors, confused about where he was and why everyone was bowing to him. Sometimes he would insist his name wasn't Charles and demand to know why people kept calling him Your Majesty. Even more heartbreaking were the times when he failed to recognize his own family. Queen Isabeau, his wife of nearly a decade, would become a complete stranger to him. His children, whom he had adored, would seem like threatening foreign visitors. His brothers and advisors, men he had worked with for years, would appear to be enemies plotting against him. Medieval medicine had absolutely no framework for understanding what was happening to their king. Court physicians tried everything from herbal remedies to religious exorcisms, convinced that Charles was either physically ill or possessed by demons. Modern historians have suggested everything from bipolar disorder to schizophrenia, but we'll never know for certain what medical condition was destroying the most powerful man in France. What we do know is how the royal court desperately tried to manage these episodes. They developed elaborate systems to hide the king's condition from foreign ambassadors and potential enemies. When Charles was having a particularly bad episode, they would cancel public appearances and claim he was suffering from a minor illness. They created special rooms where he could safely experience his delusions without hurting himself or others. But here's what made this tragedy even worse. Between episodes, Charles would often return to complete lucidity. He would remember being a capable, beloved king, and the contrast with his helpless, confused states during breakdowns was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. These periods of clarity meant that Charles was often painfully aware of what was happening to him and his kingdom. He could see the political chaos building around his weakness, but he was powerless to stop it. And that political chaos was about to tear France completely apart. Imagine trying to run a kingdom when your king randomly believes he's made of glass. Imagine trying to make crucial military decisions when your monarch might suddenly forget he's the monarch. This wasn't just a personal tragedy for Charles VI. It was a political catastrophe that would destroy France from the inside. Because here's what nobody fully anticipated. When a medieval king becomes unreliable, everyone else starts fighting over who gets to make decisions in his name. And when those people happen to be ambitious, power-hungry nobles with their own armies, things get ugly fast. The power struggle that emerged around Charles VI's incapacity was centered on two main factions. On one side, you had the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, one of Charles's uncles who had helped govern during his childhood. On the other side was Louis of Orléans, Charles's younger brother, who believed that as the king's closest male relative, he should be regent during the episodes. Both men had legitimate claims to authority. Both were intelligent, capable leaders, and both absolutely despised each other. This wasn't just some polite disagreement about policy. These were two of the most powerful men in France, each commanding vast territories, enormous wealth, and thousands of armed followers. When they disagreed about who should control the kingdom, their rivalry quickly spiraled into something much more dangerous. The situation got even more complicated because of Queen Isabeau's controversial role. While Charles was having his episodes, someone still needed to make day-to-day decisions about running the royal household and maintaining some semblance of normal court life. Isabeau stepped into this role, but her influence made both the Burgundian and Orleanist factions nervous. Medieval queens weren't supposed to wield real political power, and Isabeau's growing authority during Charles's incapacity created all kinds of rumors and accusations. Her enemies spread stories about affairs with various nobles, questioned her loyalty to France since she was originally from Bavaria, and suggested she was manipulating her sick husband for personal gain. Whether any of these accusations were true didn't really matter. What mattered was that they provided perfect ammunition for the competing factions to attack each other. If you supported Burgundy, you could claim Orléans was corrupting the queen. If you supported Orléans, you could accuse Burgundy of trying to overthrow royal authority entirely. By the late 1390s, this toxic combination of competing regencies, royal incapacity, and court scandals had divided the French nobility into two hostile camps. The Burgundians controlled much of northern and eastern France. The Orleanists dominated the area around Paris and central France. Both sides were recruiting allies, building armies, and preparing for what everyone could see was becoming inevitable. The breaking point came in 1407 when Duke Louis of Orleans was brutally assassinated on the streets of Paris by agents working for John the Fearless, the new Duke of Burgundy. This wasn't just another political murder. This was the spark that ignited full-scale civil war. Suddenly, Charles VI's mental breakdown had created something far worse than just an incapacitated king. It had created two separate French governments, each claiming legitimacy, each controlling different parts of the kingdom, and each willing to use violence to destroy the other. While the French were busy slaughtering each other over who got to control their broken king, their greatest enemies were watching from across the English Channel and sharpening their swords. Across the English Channel, King Henry V was watching the French Civil War with the kind of predatory excitement that medieval kings felt when they spotted a perfect opportunity to expand their territory. Here was France, the most powerful kingdom in Europe, literally tearing itself apart, while their king wandered around believing he was made of glass. From Henry's perspective, this was like watching your biggest rival punch themselves in the face repeatedly. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for English ambitions. The 100 Years' War had been simmering in an uneasy truce for years, but Henry V was exactly the kind of aggressive, militarily brilliant king who had been looking for an excuse to restart full-scale hostilities. And Charles VI's breakdown had just handed him the best excuse in history. Think about it from Henry's strategic perspective. France was split between two hostile factions who hated each other more than they hated England. The Burgundians and Orleanists were so busy fighting their civil war that they couldn't possibly mount a unified defense against foreign invasion. Even better, both sides were desperately looking for allies, which meant Henry could potentially play them against each other. The English struck in 1415 with a massive invasion force that landed in Normandy and began systematically conquering French territory. Henry V wasn't just raiding for loot like previous English campaigns. He was there to stay, to permanently add French lands to the English crown. And the French response was exactly as chaotic and ineffective as Henry had hoped. The Burgundians and Orleanists couldn't even agree on whether to fight the English together or try to cut separate deals. Some French nobles actually saw the English invasion as an opportunity to gain advantage over their domestic enemies. This confusion led directly to the disaster of Agincourt on October 25, 1415. Here you had the flower of French nobility, thousands of heavily armored knights who should have been able to crush any English army, charging straight into a tactical nightmare because nobody was coordinating their strategy effectively. The battle itself was a bloodbath. English longbowmen slaughtered French cavalry in the mud, while Henry V proved himself to be one of the most capable military commanders of his generation. When the fighting was over, thousands of French nobles were dead or captured, and English forces controlled huge swaths of northern France. But here's the most heartbreaking part of this whole disaster. Charles VI was aware enough during this period to understand what was happening to his kingdom. Court records show that during his lucid intervals, the king would become deeply distressed about the English victories and the ongoing civil war between his nobles. Imagine the agony of being trapped inside a mind that randomly stopped working while your life's work, the kingdom you were supposed to protect, collapsed around you. Charles would have periods of complete clarity where he could see exactly how his incapacity was enabling France's enemies, but he was powerless to fix anything. The English kept advancing, capturing city after city, while French forces remained divided and ineffective. Henry V was methodically conquering what should have been an unconquerable kingdom, and it was all possible because one king's broken mind had broken his entire country. But Henry V wasn't satisfied with just military victory. He wanted something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. He wanted to force the King of France to hand over the French throne itself. May 21st, 1420, represents the single most humiliating moment in French royal history. On that day, Charles VI, the man who had once been called Charles the Beloved, signed a document that essentially destroyed everything his ancestors had spent centuries building. The Treaty of Troyes was Henry V's masterpiece of political manipulation, and it was only possible because Charles VI's mental condition had made him completely vulnerable to pressure and coercion. Here's what this devastating agreement actually said. Charles VI would remain King of France until his death, but Henry V of England would become his heir and inherit the entire French kingdom. But wait, it gets worse. The treaty also required Charles to formally disinherit his own son, the Dauphin Charles, declaring him illegitimate and unworthy of the throne. Imagine being forced to publicly disown your own child and hand your family's ancient crown to a foreign enemy. How did things reach this impossible low point? By 1420, the combination of English military victories and French civil war had created a situation where Charles VI was essentially a prisoner of political circumstances. The Duke of Burgundy, now allied with Henry V, controlled Paris and had physical custody of the increasingly helpless king. During Charles's periods of mental clarity, he would sometimes recognize the catastrophic nature of what he was being asked to sign. Court records describe him becoming agitated and confused when presented with documents that would effectively end French independence. But during his episodes of incapacity, he could be convinced to agree to almost anything. The treaty negotiations were a masterclass in exploiting mental illness for political gain. Henry V and his allies would wait for Charles to be in one of his confused states, then pressure him to sign documents he couldn't fully understand. When Charles would recover his lucidity and protest, they would claim he had already legally agreed to everything. The document also arranged Henry V's marriage to Charles VI's daughter Catherine, creating a dynastic union that would theoretically merge the English and French crowns forever. This wasn't just political conquest. This was the complete absorption of France into the English kingdom. Think about the historical magnitude of what was happening here. France had been an independent kingdom for over 1,000 years. French culture, language, and identity were among the strongest in medieval Europe. And now, because one king's broken mind had left the country defenseless, all of that was being signed away to foreign rulers. The immediate reaction across France was shock and horror. Many French nobles refused to recognize the treaty's legitimacy, pointing out that a mentally incapacitated king couldn't legally make such massive decisions. The Dauphin, Charles, fled south and declared himself the rightful king, setting up a rival government that rejected his father's forced disinheritance. But here's the cruel irony. Even during his lucid moments, Charles VI seemed to understand that he had no realistic choice but to accept the treaty. English armies controlled most of northern France. The Civil War had exhausted French resources. Burgundy was allied with England. Resistance would just mean more warfare and suffering for his people. So the man who had once been the most beloved king in French history became the king who gave away France itself. And the worst part was that deep down, Charles VI knew exactly what he had done. The end was coming fast, and when it arrived, it would leave behind the most damaged kingdom in European history. The last 2 years of Charles VI's life were a tragic mixture of fleeting hope and ultimate despair. After signing away his kingdom in the Treaty of Troyes, the once beloved king became little more than a living symbol of French defeat, kept alive by his captors because his signature was still needed to legitimize English rule. By 1421, Charles was spending most of his time in a kind of gilded imprisonment. His mental episodes had become more frequent and more severe. But even during his periods of clarity, he seemed like a broken man who understood the magnitude of what had been lost. Court observers described him as appearing much older than his 53 years, worn down by decades of mental anguish and political humiliation. The king, who had once been famous for his energy and charisma, now shuffled through the royal apartments like a ghost. During his glass delusion episodes, he would spend days sitting motionless, terrified to move. During his periods of amnesia, he would wander the palace, asking servants why everyone was treating him like royalty when he was obviously just a confused old man. But then, in August 1422, something completely unexpected happened that briefly changed everything. Henry V of England died suddenly of dysentery while campaigning in France. For the first time in years, Charles VI experienced something resembling hope. Henry V's death meant the Treaty of Troyes was suddenly much less certain. The English heir was Henry VI, who was only 9 months old, hardly capable of ruling the vast territories his father had conquered. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for France to recover its independence. During his final months, Charles seemed to rally somewhat from his despair. Court records show him having more frequent periods of lucidity, during which he would ask anxious questions about military developments and whether his son the Dauphin was making progress in reclaiming French territory. There were even moments when the old Charles VI seemed to flicker back to life. He would discuss strategy with his remaining advisors, or show flashes of the intelligence and charisma that had once made him so beloved. For brief periods, people around him could almost forget the decades of madness and remember what he had been like as a young, promising king. But Charles VI's body was as broken as his mind. The stress of 30 years of mental illness, combined with the primitive medical treatments he had endured, had taken a devastating toll on his physical health. He was experiencing frequent fevers, chronic pain, and periods of weakness that left him bedridden for days at a time. On October 21st, 1422, just 2 months after Henry V's death, Charles VI died at the Hotel Saint-Paul in Paris. He was 54 years old and had reigned for 42 years. though only about 15 of those years could be considered effective rule. The irony of the timing was not lost on anyone who understood the historical significance. Charles VI and Henry V, the two kings whose personal conflict had devastated France, died within months of each other, leaving behind two infant heirs and a kingdom still torn apart by civil war and foreign occupation. Charles's son, now Charles VII, inherited what was barely recognizable as the France that his father had once ruled so successfully. It would take decades and the legendary intervention of Joan of Arc to even begin repairing the damage. But the question that would haunt historians for centuries was haunting. What would European history have looked like if one king's mind had never shattered in a forest? So let's step back and think about the absolutely staggering historical consequences of one king's mental breakdown in a French forest. Charles VI's tragedy didn't just destroy one man or even one reign. It fundamentally altered the course of European civilization in ways that echo through history even today. Without Charles VI's incapacity, there would have been no French civil war between the Burgundians and Orleanists. Without that civil war, Henry V's invasion of France would have faced unified resistance from one of the strongest kingdoms in medieval Europe. Without English conquest, there would have been no Treaty of Troy, no disinherited Dauphin, and no need for someone like Joan of Arc to emerge and rally French resistance. Think about it this way. Virtually every major development in late medieval French and English history can be traced back to that moment when Charles VI drew his sword against his own knights. The entire trajectory of the 100 Years' War changed because of his mental illness. English control over French territory, the development of French national identity, even the eventual rise of absolute monarchy in France, all of these massive historical trends were shaped by one king's psychological collapse. Modern medical experts have spent decades trying to diagnose what actually happened to Charles VI. Some historians suggest he suffered from bipolar disorder, pointing to his alternating periods of lucidity and mania. Others think he may have had a form of schizophrenia, given his delusions and episodes of not recognizing family members. There are even theories about possible brain injuries from his various fevers and illnesses. But here's what we know for certain. Charles VI was suffering from a severe, chronic mental health condition that medieval medicine couldn't understand, treat, or manage effectively. In a modern world with proper psychiatric care, his story might have been completely different. With appropriate medication and therapy, he might have remained the beloved, capable king he was during his early reign. The tragedy is that his condition was almost certainly treatable by modern standards, but in 1392, mental illness was viewed as either divine punishment, demonic possession, or simple physical imbalance. The treatments he received, herbal remedies, bloodletting, exorcisms, probably made his condition worse rather than better. Charles VI's story also reveals something crucial about how individual psychology can impact massive historical forces. We often think about history as being driven by economic factors, social movements, or military technologies. But sometimes, the mental health of one crucial person can redirect the entire course of civilization. The damaged kingdom Charles VI left behind would eventually recover and become stronger than ever under later French kings. But the decades of warfare, destruction, and political chaos that resulted from his breakdown cost hundreds of thousands of lives and set back French development by generations. His legacy serves as a reminder that behind every crown, every throne, and every royal title was a human being with all the psychological fragility that entails. So what shocked you most about Charles VI's mental breakdown and how it changed history? Was it the glass delusion, the Treaty of Troyes, or how close France came to permanent English rule? Comment below because I read every single one. And if you want more stories about how royal psychological crises shaped European history, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because next week I'm bringing you a medieval king whose paranoid delusions led to one of the most brutal purges in royal history.